The intentions were good, but they were wrong. They decided they wanted to give them the best of English education. So they were run on the model of private schools, with a headmaster who was always an Anglican priest, usually with a long black robe on, and teachers that you had to stand up when they entered the room. I mean, so many things so different from their own education system, where the parents raised the kids and provided the food, but the grandparents provided the education and the spirituality. And so now there's a whole new system. It's no longer the grandparents who are the educators, but now these imported people who had you line up, sit in rows, and don't make mistakes. If you hold your hand up like this, you don't hold your hands right for prayers, you got a ruler across your knuckles. Well, it happened to the kings of England. Why shouldn't it happen to people in Nova Scotia going to a residential school? Just how it was. And so the residential school, with the best intentions, to give the best education possible, caused people to begin to misunderstand and be confused about their own culture. And slowly the culture was taken away. And then later on, the government of Canada made a policy of assimilation, that Indigenous Canadians would be assimilated into Canadian culture, white, European, Canadian culture. And that they would take in order to do that, they would no longer be able to speak their language, and that their culture would be taken away. And unfortunately, the church that I belong to bought into that, probably for financial reasons. So it became government-owned, church-run residential schools. The diocese where I became bishop in 1992 had a residential school, St. George's Residential School, and it was a combination of All Hallows Girls' School, and they came together at Lytton to form, and it was a radical idea at the time, having girls and boys in the same school, but that's what happened. It was on a wonderful farm where people learned about farming skills and all, but the same kind of things took place. Children were separated from their families. Remember now, a family would include parents and grandparents and all the relations. The education would be holistic. And now taken miles away from home and placed in a residential school, and lineups and lineups and lineups for everything. Food they were not used to, people were not used to, cannot use their own language, their own culture. And there was harsh punishment. People often treated roughly. Young girls dragged by their hair into the classroom. People would be punished by having all their hair taken off. Things that we wouldn't do today, but we did then, and called it being civilized. But the tough part was losing language and losing culture. It is through language that we know who we are. That's why I'm proud as a Canadian to know that we have cultural centers for every nationality, so that Canada is a country where we honor the traditions from which people come, so that we encourage people to be bilingual. We encourage people to be multilingual. My grandson Jason takes French. Sammy is 7 years old, and he goes to French immersion school. But because there are many Asian kids in the classroom, he also speaks Cantonese in the schoolyard. And I'm kind of proud of that. Now, this assimilation policy that the church bought into was very, very costly, and one for which I am ashamed. Now, how do you respond to all of this? When I became bishop, I spent a lot of time just listening. And because a fifth of the people in the diocese were Indigenous, I went to the clergy of those particular parishes and talked with them, and they gave me some wonderful advice. Listen to the elders. Listen to the elders. Wish my grandchildren would get that one. And I did. I never, ever made a visit to anyone without an elder with me. I never, ever made a decision without asking the elders. Principle I adopted, and they taught me so much. And then they said to me, you have to face the fact of the residential school. Abuse took place, not by a priest, not by an Anglican clergy person or worker, but a person who did not belong to the Anglican Church, who was a young boy who was abused as a child in England and came to Canada, and at the age of 18 was hired as a person in residence. And he molested many kids, and he's now serving 35-year jail sentence. But because it was on our watch, because the principal of the school was an Anglican priest, and even though the government was an employer, I believe we had moral and pastoral responsibility for that situation and tried to settle at 20 to 80, as I thought would be fair. We did, in fact, lose the court case, and it was 60-40 in favor of the government. But I'll say more about that part when we come to it. So they asked me to go to healing circles, and it was quite an experience going to healing circles. When a healing circle takes place, you don't say anything until the elder comes, and you don't leave until the elder leaves, period. And so I went to the elders and said, how does a person like me go to a healing circle? And they said, come back next time you come and ask us. We'll think about it. Often I never got answers when I asked the question. I had to wait for a bit to see whether I was really serious about the question, because sometimes they thought people like me ask questions but don't really care about the answer. So I come back and I said, well, I'm going to a healing circle. How do I behave? And they said, listen. Listen with your whole body and not just your ears. Don't talk too much. And for goodness sake, don't tell us the good things that the church did for us. When we're ready and we know that we have been heard, let us tell that story. And just in case I forget or run out of time, they did. They kept their promise. So I go to healing circles where I would be treated as if I were the person who had done the abusing. And I'd hear person after person tell their stories of physical and mental, sexual, cultural abuse. And then I'd hear it, and it would be a talking stick, and each person would pass it on. And I wouldn't say anything. And then the elder would stand, and I'd go home. A long drive from one of the reserves off to where I lived in Kamloops. I remember one night when I was driving home, I was exhausted. I'd been treated as if I had been an abuser for several hours. It was very late when we finished. You never leave the circle until everyone has had a chance to speak once or twice. And I remember pulling my car over the side of the road and just wept, looking down on the valley where I was. And then suddenly I had an incredible feeling. It was around this time of year. It was Lent in the Anglican Church. And I have to say, in that moment, I think I became closer to Jesus than I had at any other time in my life, because I began to realize that he had suffered every time anyone suffered in those residential schools. That God suffered when other people suffered. And I began to learn that when one person suffered in a residential school, every member of our diocese had to suffer with them, even though the suffering is different. Because the people who are abused might not ever get over their suffering. It might be with them for the rest of their lives. And that's why when I'm talking about this journey, I have to be so careful I don't say it's a success story. It's a journey. And everybody's at a different place on it. But there was a shadow over all of this. Because there was a teacher who later became ordained, who was suspected of abuse, and he was acquitted in court. And that acquittal hung like a shadow over the diocese. And I always had to find myself walking in darkness, it seemed like. Because it's one of those kind of family secrets. And who knows? But it was a shadow. So I went to healing circles. And I went to healing gatherings, which is a place, the word pulka means healing lake. For centuries, the people had gone there for healing. And they asked me to go along with the chief and the medical doctor myself, to be part of the healing at Pulka Lake.